I have a question for you. Do you have a sacred place in your life? A place where you can go that's away from it all? A place where you can be still and be with God? A peaceful place where everything else seems to just dissolve in the background. And maybe it's a beautiful lake or a creek where you went fishing when you were a kid. Maybe it's a special church. Maybe it's a person. I still remember my first sacred place. It was a baby grand piano that my parents bought, and they placed it in their house. So from the time I was a little kid, I would go to that piano and I would play and play. And as I grew, I found that when life got distracting, when I'd had a bad day, or when my dad was having cancer treatments, when things in life just weren't going the way that I thought they were supposed to go, that piano, that sacred place, was a place where I could go and everything would just dissolve. It was like I was in that place alone with God, and I was always at peace when I sat there. I still remember the day that sacred place was taken from me. My parents decided to do what no parent should ever do, by the way. They decided to move. Now, they were just moving from one house to another house on the other side of town, but for me this was significant. I was a senior in college, and it seemed like everything that I knew was being taken away from me. Well, I came home from college to help with the move, and on moving day it was my job to be at the old house while all of the things were being moved to the new house. And I still remember when that last box was taken from the house, there was only one single solitary item left. And you guessed it, it was the grand piano. I was so excited to have one last sacred moment in my sacred space. I was the only person in the house. I went over to that piano and I went to open up the lid so that I could put my hands on the keys and start playing. But the lid was locked. Yeah, it was locked up. It was like my sacred space had been messed with. Go with me now to the Sea of Galilee, where the disciples are standing around. It's after Jesus had been crucified, and then he rose again, and they were so excited. They saw him, and they touched him, and they talked to him. But then he left them again. And so they're waiting. They're confused by all of the events that have taken place over the last several days, and they're sad, and their life is lacking direction. So they stand around, and you can just kind of picture them skipping rocks on the shore of Galilee. And finally Peter, he's just tired of it all. He's tired of crying. He's tired of getting choked up every time he starts to talk. He's tired of feeling immobilized. So he looks at the guys, just feeling like he has to do something, and he says, "I'm going fishing." You can kind of see the other guys, they look at each other and they kind of nod and they say, "Yeah, we'll go with you." And so they get in the boat and they head out to the Sea of Galilee. You can imagine that the fishing boat for them might have been kind of a sacred place, in a place where they could go and get away from it all. And that's where they went with Jesus when he wanted to get away from the crowds, and they had some of the most amazing times with him in the fishing boat. And so when they crawled in that boat, they must have been thinking, with hopeful hearts, maybe some of that sacred space can be recreated for us here today. Except we all kind of know what happens, don't we? Well, they get out there and, at first their spirits are high and they're hopeful. But then it's just plain bad fishing, kind of like it is here today. I mean, no fish. But they keep at it all night long, and And I can only imagine that as the night lingers on, the joy that they were feeling when they climbed into the boat begins to turn again into sadness, and the silence creeps back in, and they feel like their sacred place has been messed with. They feel like their sacred place has been locked up and maybe only a distant memory for them. And then the coolest thing happened. After fishing all night long, at the crack of dawn, the disciples heard this voice. "Hey guys, throw your net to the other side of the boat." So the disciples took their net and they threw it to the other side of the boat. And what they experienced was fish, and more fish. So many fish that their net was bursting at the seams. Well, it dawned on them at that moment that there was only one person that they knew of that could make this happen. And so Peter, in all of his excitement, knowing it was Jesus, kind of did what I think is the funniest scene in the Bible. He found his outer garment and he put it on and he jumped in the water and swam as fast as he possibly could to the shore. He was just so excited to see Jesus again. Well, when they got to the shore, what they found was that Jesus had already started a fire, had already started cooking fish for them. Jesus was throwing a party for them on a beach at the crack of dawn. And so for the rest of the day, they sat around and they talked with Jesus and they ate fish. And the disciples had a party with Jesus as the host. I think the turning point in this story, the point that I don't want any of us to miss, is that voice that calls from the shore. Cast your nets to the other side of the boat. I mean, Jesus is making it clear to the disciples that life isn't going to be the same now. Life after crucifixion and resurrection is going to look different. I mean, he came into their lives and he messed with their sacred space. And now that their sacred space has been messed with, things are just going to have to look a little different. But you know what? Their sacred space has been messed with by Jesus, the one who can bring light into the deepest darkness that this world has to offer, the one who brings hope even into situations that seem hopeless, the one who can make dry bones dance. Do you remember my sacred space, that grand piano in that bay window? Well, today it sits in my own house that I own with my husband, and it sits in our bay window in our living room. And it's still a place where I can go when I need to find peace and pour my heart out to God. But it's also a place where I sit with my two little girls and teach them how to play the piano and teach them how to pour their heart out through song and to be still with God. I love that God messed with my sacred space because in doing so, He's given me abundant life. He's filled my life to overflowing, just like those fish nets that were bursting at the seams on the Sea of Galilee that day. It would be a pretty tidy story if our gospel lesson ended with a party on the beach and the disciples just having fun and kicking back with Jesus. But it doesn't end there. After they've eaten all of the fish and kind of settled down, Jesus takes Peter aside. And we all know that before Jesus was crucified, Peter denied him 3 times. And so Jesus takes him aside in an attempt to restore that denial. Jesus grills Peter. He says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter looks at Jesus and says, "Of course I love you. You know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Well, then feed my lambs." And again, Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" And Peter again says, "You know I love you. I love you more than life." And Jesus says, "Then tend my sheep." And a third time, Jesus asks him, Peter, do you love me? And Peter looks him in the eyes and says, Jesus, you know that I love you. And again, Jesus says, Peter, tend my sheep. Jesus says to Peter that day, be my hands and my feet in this world. It's like he's saying to him, you know, you've received a blessing, now go and be a blessing. Wherever you go with the Word of God is a sacred space. That's where Jesus shows up. That's where Jesus calls and says, cast your nets to the other side of the boat. He asks us to go into the corridors of the hospitals and nursing homes and bring healing and hope to those who are sick and hurting. He asks us to go to the back streets of the city and to feed those who can't feed themselves. He asks us to go to the forgotten villages in Africa and to give voice to those who are voiceless. Wherever you go with the good news of God through Jesus Christ is a sacred space. You have come and you have been blessed. Now go, be a blessing.